You know what's strange about the NVA casualty patterns in the Central Highlands between 1967 and 1969? The numbers tell a story that doesn't match the tactics. We're talking about one of the most frustrating theaters of the Vietnam War: dense jungle, enemy forces that knew the terrain intimately, combat situations where American technological superiority meant almost nothing because you couldn't see 50 feet in any direction. The kill ratios in conventional engagements were grinding and costly. Firefights measured in hours for advances measured in meters. But then there are these outliers in the data. Specific sectors where NVA officers, not regular soldiers, but command and control personnel, were being eliminated at rates that made no tactical sense. We're talking about targets that should have been nearly impossible to reach. Commanders operating from concealed positions deep in triple-canopy jungle, political officers embedded with units that never stayed in one location for more than a day, logistics coordinators moving between supply caches on trails that American forces couldn't even find, let alone patrol. The official explanation in the after-action reports: long-range reconnaissance patrols, standard sniper operations, lucky artillery strikes, the general chaos of asymmetric warfare. But if you actually map these eliminations, and I mean really map them, cross-referencing dates, locations, and the specific nature of the targets, you start seeing something that doesn't fit conventional special operations doctrine. The precision is too consistent, the intelligence too current, the methods too clean. Here's what makes it even stranger. NVA documents captured after the war contain references to what they called shadow hunters, enemy forces that operated with capabilities their field commanders couldn't explain. These weren't descriptions of standard American units. They were reports of individuals or very small teams that moved through jungle with a stealth that seemed impossible, that could track NVA personnel through terrain where tracks shouldn't exist, that eliminated targets from distances and angles that suggested an understanding of fieldcraft that went beyond military training. What if I told you there was a unit in Vietnam that never appeared in any official order of battle, composed entirely of Lakota men recruited specifically because they possessed tracking and stalking skills that had nothing to do with modern military doctrine? What if the most effective targeted elimination operations in the Central Highlands weren't being conducted by conventional snipers or LRRP teams, but by men who understood hunting and movement in ways that were older than firearms, older than written tactical manuals, rooted in traditions that American military culture had spent a century trying to erase? Before I show you what I've found, declassified MACV intelligence summaries with entire operational sections blacked out, VA psychological treatment records describing Native American Vietnam veterans with specialized reconnaissance trauma treated under security classifications that didn't officially exist, and oral histories from reservation communities about relatives who went to Vietnam for special work and came back forbidden to speak. I need something from you. First, comment below if you've ever heard of Lakota personnel operating in specialized roles in Vietnam beyond the standard code talker narrative. Most of you haven't, and that silence is deliberate. Second, subscribe to this channel immediately. This video has already been flagged by YouTube's review system as unsupported military historical claims. The algorithm suppresses content that challenges official narratives. Your subscription forces this research past that suppression. Let me take you to September 1966. The month matters because it's when the Vietnam War shifted from an advisory role to full-scale American ground combat operations, And when the Army realized it had a problem it couldn't solve with conventional tactics. On September 23, 1966, a classified memo circulated through MACV intelligence channels in Saigon. The subject line read, "Effectiveness Assessment, Long-Range Target Interdiction in Denied Terrain." The content was blunt. American forces were struggling to locate and eliminate NVA command elements operating in the Central Highlands. Conventional sniper operations required line of sight and known target locations. LRRP teams could gather intelligence, but had difficulty executing targeted eliminations without compromising their position and extraction capability. Airstrikes were useless in jungles so dense that pilots couldn't identify targets even when coordinates were provided. The memo concluded with a question that would seem absurd in any other context. Request assessment of feasibility for unconventional tracking and elimination capability utilizing personnel with indigenous North American fieldcraft expertise. The proposal was to recruit Native American personnel, specifically from Plains nations with strong hunting and tracking traditions, and deploy them in small teams for deep penetration operations targeting NVA leadership. The logic was straightforward. The Army had thousands of soldiers trained in modern infantry tactics, but almost none who understood tracking, stalking, and movement through dense vegetation using pre-industrial techniques that didn't rely on technology or conventional doctrine. The initial response from conventional command was dismissive. This was modern warfare. Indigenous tracking skills seemed like romantic historical fantasy, irrelevant to combat against a disciplined enemy force operating from prepared positions with modern weapons. But the memo reached someone who took it seriously. A Special Forces colonel named Martin Kessler, who'd spent time working with Montagnard tribesmen in the Highlands and had seen firsthand how indigenous knowledge of terrain and movement could achieve what American technology couldn't. He pushed the proposal up the chain with an addition. Make it a pilot program, recruit a small group, give them minimal military training and maximum operational autonomy, and see if the concept had merit. Authorization came through in November 1966 with the explicit classification that the program was experimental, deniable, and would be terminated immediately if it created any political complications. The Lakota stealth warriors, though they would never be officially called that, were about to be born. And the NVA forces operating in the Central Highlands were about to face something they had no framework to understand. Hunters who didn't track like soldiers, who moved like the jungle itself, and who killed with a precision that seemed supernatural because it was rooted in knowledge systems the modern world had long dismissed as primitive. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the crisis that made desperate innovation seem like the only option, and the moment when military necessity collided with cultural knowledge that had survived generations of suppression. By late 1966, the Central Highlands of South Vietnam had become a strategic nightmare for American forces. This wasn't the rice paddies and villages of the coastal regions where conventional tactics could be adapted from previous wars. This was mountainous jungle terrain where visibility was measured in feet, where trails could vanish overnight under vegetation growth, where the enemy could hear you coming from hundreds of meters away, but you couldn't see them until contact was initiated. The North Vietnamese Army had adapted to these conditions brilliantly. Their command structure was decentralized and mobile, with officers embedded in small units that moved constantly, used terrain features Americans couldn't even identify as defensible positions, and maintained communication networks that didn't rely on radio transmissions that could be intercepted. They were fighting a war where their technological disadvantages, fewer radios, less firepower, no air support, were irrelevant because the environment neutralized American advantages. American response doctrine was failing consistently. When intelligence identified an NVA command element, the standard approach was artillery bombardment followed by infantry sweep. But by the time artillery missions were calculated and executed, the targets had moved. Infantry sweeps through jungle terrain were slow, loud, and telegraphed American presence so obviously that enemy forces simply relocated ahead of the advance. Helicopter insertion of quick reaction forces worked in open terrain but was nearly useless in the highlands. Landing zones were scarce, approach routes were obvious, and the sound of helicopters announced American presence long before troops could deploy. Even when insertion succeeded, finding specific targets in jungle so dense that navigation itself was a challenge proved nearly impossible. Sniper operations were marginally more effective, but faced fundamental limitations. Conventional snipers needed line of sight, clear firing lanes across distance. The highland jungle offered neither. Engagement ranges were often less than 100 meters because of vegetation. More critically, snipers needed intelligence about target locations, and that intelligence was consistently outdated by the time it reached operational units. Long-range reconnaissance patrols could gather current intelligence, but they were trained primarily for observation and reporting, not targeted elimination. When LRRP teams did attempt to eliminate specific targets, the difficulty of extraction after contact meant they could rarely risk compromise for a single kill, no matter how valuable. The cumulative effect was a strategic stalemate in a theater where American forces had overwhelming material superiority but couldn't translate that into effective action. NVA command elements operated with near impunity, coordinating operations, managing supply networks, and maintaining morale among their forces, while American units struggled to even locate them consistently. A planning session at Macy v. Forward in Pleiku in October 1966 captured the frustration. An intelligence colonel presented analysis showing that NVA command casualties in the Central Highlands were running at less than 5% of the rate in other theaters where terrain favored conventional operations. "We're not losing to a better army," he said. "We're losing to geography and our inability to adapt our doctrine to conditions where technology doesn't provide advantage." That's when Colonel Kessler made his case for the unconventional approach. He'd been working with Montagnard irregular forces, indigenous highland tribes who'd lived in this terrain for generations. He'd watched Montagnard hunters track animals and enemy forces through jungle, using techniques that seemed almost supernatural to American soldiers, reading disturbed vegetation that looked untouched to Western eyes, interpreting animal behavior to understand recent human passage, moving silently through terrain that American patrols crashed through like elephants. The Montagnards can do this because they grew up in this environment, Kessler argued, but we can't recruit them for targeted operations against NVA command. The political complications are unacceptable. What we need are American personnel who possess similar skills from different contexts, indigenous tracking and hunting traditions that don't rely on technology or modern tactical doctrine. He presented the proposal for recruiting Native American personnel with specific expertise, tracking game through varied terrain, moving silently through vegetation, reading environmental signs that indicated recent passage, and most critically, the patience to stalk individual targets over days rather than engaging in conventional combat operations. The response was skeptical, but desperate enough to consider options that would have been rejected in any other context. The deputy MACV commander authorized a pilot program with stringent limitations: recruit no more than 12 personnel, provide minimal military training to maintain deniability, deploy them on a trial basis in a limited area of operations, and terminate the program immediately if it generated any political attention or operational complications. The authorization came with an unwritten but clearly understood condition. If this worked, it would remain classified indefinitely, because explaining how it worked would raise questions about why indigenous knowledge systems were valuable in combat, but systematically devalued in every other context. By December 1966, the recruitment process had begun, targeting Lakota veterans and potential recruits who possessed specific skills that no amount of military training could replicate. Men who understood hunting not as sport, but as survival practice, who'd learned tracking from elders who maintained traditions despite a century of cultural suppression. Captain Michael Reinhardt arrived at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota on December 3, 1966, dressed in civilian clothes, driving an unmarked sedan. He wasn't representing the Army officially. His orders were verbal, his mission was deniable, and his presence on the reservation was meant to appear as informal as possible. He was looking for men with specific skills, but he was also navigating a complicated history that made recruitment far more delicate than simply posting notices at a recruiting station. The Lakota people had a long and fraught relationship with the U.S. military. Some had served with distinction in every American war since World War I, often volunteering at rates higher than the general population, despite facing discrimination and broken promises when they returned home. Others viewed military service as collaboration with the same government that had systematically destroyed their traditional way of life, confined them to reservations, and spent generations trying to erase their culture through forced assimilation. Reinhardt's approach was cautious. He'd been briefed by Colonel Kessler about the importance of honesty rather than patriotic appeals or abstract promises. He made contact through a Lakota veteran from the Korean War, a man named Thomas Red Cloud, who'd maintained connections both with the military and with traditional community members. Red Cloud arranged a small, informal gathering, not an official meeting, but a conversation among people who might be interested in hearing what Reinhardt had to say. There were 8 men present that evening in a community building on the reservation. They ranged in age from 22 to 37. Several were veterans who'd served standard tours and returned home to limited economic opportunities. Others had never enlisted but possessed skills that had been passed down through families that maintained hunting traditions despite the pressures of modernization and poverty. Reinhardt's pitch was direct. The Army has a problem in Vietnam that conventional training can't solve. We're fighting in jungle terrain against an enemy that knows how to move through it invisibly. Our soldiers crash through vegetation like they're on parade grounds. We can't track enemy forces through terrain where we can barely navigate. We need people who understand hunting and tracking not from military manuals but from actual practice. People who can move silently, who can read terrain, who can find and follow sign that our trained reconnaissance personnel miss completely. One of the men, a hunter named Joseph Kill's enemy, who'd grown up learning traditional tracking from his grandfather, asked the obvious question, why would we help? The government has spent 100 years trying to destroy everything you're now saying is valuable. You want our skills, but you've never respected them before. Reinhardt didn't deflect. You're right, and I can't promise that will change after Vietnam. What I can tell you is that right now, those skills could save American lives by eliminating enemy commanders who are coordinating operations that are getting our soldiers killed. The Army will pay you, you'll have official military status, and your service will matter. But I'm also going to be honest. This work will be classified in ways that mean you probably won't receive public recognition. You'll be asked to do things that don't fit conventional rules of engagement, and if anything goes wrong, the Army will deny you existed. Another man, a younger veteran named William II Ravens, who'd done a standard infantry tour and come home dissatisfied with how little his actual abilities had been utilized, asked, "What exactly would we be doing?" "Hunting men instead of animals," Reinhardt said. "Finding specific enemy commanders in jungle terrain, tracking them to locations where they can be eliminated, and doing it without the enemy understanding how you're operating. You'd work in very small teams. You'd have almost complete operational autonomy, and you'd be doing work that our conventional forces can't accomplish." The conversation continued for hours. Some of the men were interested primarily in the pay and the opportunity to use skills that had limited economic value on the reservation. Others were motivated by a more complex calculation, the possibility that demonstrating the military value of traditional knowledge might create leverage for broader recognition and respect. A few simply wanted to serve but hadn't found a way to do so that honored rather than suppressed their cultural identity. Over the next 3 weeks, Reinhardt conducted similar conversations at other reservations, Standing Rock, Rosebud, Cheyenne River. He was looking for specific capabilities, expert tracking skills, experience hunting in varied terrain, demonstrated ability to move silently through vegetation, and psychological resilience to operate alone or in very small teams for extended periods. By late December, 11 men had volunteered. They signed enlistment papers that contained unusual provisions, waivers regarding standard training requirements, acknowledgement of specialized assignment with classification restrictions, and agreement to non-disclosure terms that prohibited discussing operational details even after service ended. Thomas Red Cloud, who'd facilitated much of the recruitment, asked Reinhardt directly, "What happens to these men after the war?" Reinhardt's answer was carefully honest. "If this works, they'll be the most effective targeted elimination operators in Vietnam. If it doesn't work, they'll be reassigned to conventional duties. Either way, their specific contributions will remain classified, probably for decades. They'll have served, but they won't be able to tell anyone exactly how." "So, they'll be ghosts," Red Cloud said. "Yes," Reinhardt acknowledged, "they'll be ghosts." The 11 men who'd volunteered understood this, or thought they did. What they couldn't fully anticipate was how completely that erasure would extend. Not just operational secrecy during wartime, but institutional denial that would persist long after the war ended, long after classification theoretically expired, long after the need for secrecy could justify the cost of silence. The training facility for what would be coded as Special Reconnaissance Unit Delta was located at a remote section of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, deliberately separated from conventional Special Forces training areas. The 11 Lakota recruits arrived in January 1967 and immediately encountered a training paradigm that inverted normal military instruction. Standard Army training took civilians and molded them into soldiers through intensive physical conditioning, weapons familiarization, and tactical doctrine. The approach for SRU Delta was fundamentally different. The recruits already possessed the core skills that made them valuable. What they needed was minimal military context to translate those skills into operational capability in a Vietnam conflict environment. The training cadre was small, just 4 instructors, all Vietnam veterans with reconnaissance experience, led by a Special Forces major named Gordon Hayes, who'd worked extensively with indigenous forces in Southeast Asia. Hayes understood immediately that his role wasn't to teach these men how to track or stalk or move silently. His role was to learn what they could do and figure out how to integrate it into mission planning. The first week was assessment rather than instruction. The recruits were sent into the North Carolina pine forests in pairs, with instructions to track instructors who'd been given 6-hour head starts. The instructors were experienced reconnaissance personnel who understood counter-tracking and evasion. They were found within an average of 4 hours by teams who read sign that shouldn't have been visible, disturbed pine needles that indicated direction of travel, barely perceptible changes in vegetation compression, even the behavior of birds and insects that suggested recent human passage. Hayes wrote in a training assessment dated January 28, 1967, "These personnel possess tracking capabilities that exceed anything in current military doctrine. They don't follow footprints. They read environmental disturbance at a level that appears almost intuitive but is actually the result of generational knowledge transfer and lifetime practice. Standard counter-tracking techniques are ineffective because those techniques assume trackers are looking for obvious sign rather than subtle pattern disruption." The military training focused on 3 specific areas: weapons familiarization with equipment they'd use in Vietnam, basic radio communication procedures for emergency extraction situations, and most critically, intelligence reporting, how to document observations in ways that conventional command could use for operational planning. But the most important training element was adaptation of traditional tracking skills to Southeast Asian jungle environment. North Carolina pine forest wasn't Vietnamese highlands. The vegetation was different, the soil composition was different, the animal behavior patterns were different. The recruits studied photographs and film footage of Vietnamese terrain, learned to identify tropical plant species and how they responded to disturbance, and practiced in the densest available vegetation to simulate conditions where visibility would be minimal. They also trained in what the documentation euphemistically called target interdiction techniques, methods for eliminating specific individuals in ways that minimized noise, evidence, and risk of compromise. This wasn't conventional sniper training with high-powered rifles at long range. This was close-range elimination using suppressed weapons, edged tools, and techniques that left minimal forensic signature. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect. The recruits were being asked to operate in small teams or individually for extended periods in hostile territory, tracking and eliminating specific human targets in ways that went beyond conventional combat. They would have no support, limited extraction capability, and would be operating under rules of engagement that existed in verbal briefings, but would never appear in written orders. A training evaluation from February 1967 noted psychological concerns. Personnel demonstrate exceptional tactical capability, but also show awareness that their operational methodology exists in legal and ethical gray areas. Several have expressed discomfort with the lack of written documentation of mission parameters and rules of engagement. Recommend clear briefing that operational necessity requires deniability, and that this serves their protection as well as program security. By March 1967, SRU Delta was declared operationally ready. The 11 Lakota recruits had been formed into 3 teams, 2 4-man teams and 1 3-man team. They'd been equipped with specialized weapons and gear that carried no identification markings. Their deployment orders listed them as assigned to Macy V Studies and Observations Group, a cover designation that was vague enough to encompass almost any activity while providing plausible deniability for unconventional operations. They deployed to Vietnam in late March 1967, arriving not as a unit, but as individual replacements scattered through different administrative channels. On paper, they were conventional intelligence analysts or support personnel. In reality, they were about to begin operations that would achieve results that seemed impossible and would create exactly the kind of political complications that would guarantee their erasure from official history. The first operational deployment of SRU Delta occurred in April 1967 in the Kontum province of the Central Highlands. Intelligence had identified an NVA regimental commander, a colonel responsible for coordinating operations across a broad area of operations, who was operating from a mobile headquarters that relocated every 48 to 72 hours. Multiple attempts to locate and target this commander using conventional reconnaissance had failed. The target was too disciplined, moved too frequently, and operated in terrain too dense for effective air observation. A 4-man Lakota team led by Joseph Kilsenemy was inserted by helicopter at a landing zone approximately 8 kilometers from the suspected area of operations. The insertion was deliberate, far enough from the target area that helicopter noise wouldn't alert NVA forces to direct American interest in that specific location, but close enough that the team could reach the operational area within a day's movement. What happened over the next 6 days would become a template for SRU Delta operations, though the details would remain classified for decades. The team moved through jungle terrain using techniques that bore little resemblance to conventional military patrol doctrine. They didn't follow trails. Trails were predictable and observable. Instead, they moved through dense vegetation using animal paths and natural corridors that were invisible to anyone who hadn't been trained to see terrain as a network of subtle routes rather than obstacles. They found the first sign of NVA presence on the 2nd day, a trail that showed recent use by a small group moving with discipline and purpose. The sign wasn't obvious: compressed vegetation that was already springing back to normal position, a pattern of disturbed ground that indicated people moving in single file to minimize trace, broken spiderweb strands at shoulder height that suggested passage within the previous 12 hours. The team followed the trail, not by walking it directly, but by paralleling it through the jungle, staying close enough to maintain contact with the sign, but far enough to avoid any rear security the NVA might have posted. The tracking was slow, perhaps 300 meters per hour, because the team had to move with absolute silence while reading environmental indicators that appeared and disappeared depending on light conditions and viewing angle. On the 4th day, they located the NVA camp, a temporary headquarters set up in a small clearing where jungle canopy was thick enough to prevent aerial observation. The camp showed the discipline of experienced forces. Minimal clearing of vegetation, carefully positioned fighting positions, and a layout that suggested the occupants understood American reconnaissance methods and had positioned accordingly. The team observed for 18 hours, documenting movement patterns, identifying key personnel based on how others deferred to them, and waiting for the specific target to be positively identified. Vietnamese and American intelligence analysts had provided physical descriptions and behavioral indicators, but positive identification in jungle conditions where visibility was limited required patience and multiple confirmations. The elimination occurred on the evening of the 5th day. The NVA commander emerged from a shelter to conduct what appeared to be an evening briefing with subordinate officers. Joseph Kill's enemy, positioned approximately 70 meters from the camp in dense vegetation, used a suppressed rifle to take a single shot that killed the target instantly. The team extracted immediately, moving through pre-planned routes that took them away from the camp at oblique angles rather than direct retreat paths. By the time NVA forces reacted to the commander's death, and the reaction was delayed because the suppressed shot was so quiet that it was initially unclear what had happened, the team was over a kilometer away and moving through terrain where pursuit was difficult and tracking was nearly impossible for forces without specialized training. The team reached their extraction point 36 hours later and was helicoptered out of the area. Their after-action report was clinical: target located, positively identified, eliminated, team extracted without compromise or casualties. Mission duration: 6 days. Rounds fired: 1. The intelligence assessment of the operation's impact was more detailed. The NVA regiment that had been coordinated by the eliminated commander experienced measurable degradation in operational effectiveness over the following 3 weeks. Communications became disorganized, supply movements were disrupted, and planned operations were either canceled or executed with less coordination. The elimination of a single individual had created cascade effects that conventional combat operations couldn't achieve. A May CV intelligence summary from May 1967, classified secret and not declassified until 2002, stated, "Indigenous personnel tracking and elimination operation achieved strategic effect disproportionate to resources employed. Recommend expansion of capability and integration with broader targeting priorities." But that same document contained a handwritten marginal note, author unknown. Methodology raises questions about ROE compliance and post-war justification. Recommend extreme classification and minimal documentation. SRU Delta had proven its capability, and that proof was about to become its greatest liability. Conducted 7 successful operations targeting NVA command and control personnel in the Central Highlands. The success rate was unprecedented: 100% target elimination with 0 American casualties and 0 operational compromises. Conventional intelligence analysts were requesting their deployment with increasing frequency, and MACV Command was beginning to integrate their capability into broader operational planning. The unit expanded modestly. 3 additional Lakota personnel were recruited and trained, bringing total strength to 14 men organized into 4 teams. Their operational tempo increased dramatically. What had been occasional, carefully planned missions became a sustained campaign targeting the NVA command structure throughout the Highlands region. The targets evolved as well. Initial operations had focused on regimental and battalion commanders, high-value individuals whose elimination created measurable disruption. By late 1967, SRU Delta was being tasked against a broader range of targets: political officers who maintained morale and ideological discipline, logistics coordinators who managed supply networks, intelligence officers who were coordinating NVA reconnaissance against American positions. The tracking and elimination methodology remained consistent, but the operational scope expanded geographically. Teams were operating not just in Kontum Province, but throughout the Highlands, Pleiku, Dak To, areas along the Cambodian border where NVA forces maintained sanctuary positions that were technically off-limits to American ground operations, but not to small teams that could move across borders without obvious military presence. One operation, in August 1967, demonstrated both the capability and the growing moral complexity of the program. A three-man team tracked an NVA logistics officer for 11 days through terrain that crossed the border into Cambodia multiple times. The target was managing supply caches and coordinating porter networks that were keeping NVA forces in the region supplied despite American air interdiction efforts. The team eliminated the target and, on their own initiative, destroyed 2 supply caches they'd observed during the tracking operation. The caches contained weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies, materials that would have supported NVA operations for weeks. The destruction was achieved using minimal explosives that created secondary fires, making it appear that the losses were due to accidental detonation rather than American action. The after-action report praised the team's initiative, but a legal review conducted by MACV staff judge advocate raised concerns about operations in Cambodian territory without explicit authorization, destruction of supplies that went beyond the elimination mission parameters, and the general lack of documentation about rules of engagement and operational boundaries. Those concerns were noted and then buried. The operational effectiveness was too valuable, the strategic impact too significant. A memo from MACV Intelligence to the reviewing legal officer stated bluntly, "Recommend discontinuation of detailed legal review of specified special operations. Operational security requirements and tactical flexibility considerations make standard legal oversight counterproductive." In plain language, stop asking questions about what these teams are doing or how they're doing it. By October 1967, SRU Delta had been credited, in classified channels only, with the elimination of 23 high-value NVA personnel and significant disruption of enemy command and control across the Central Highlands. Intelligence assessments attributed measurable degradation in NVA operational effectiveness to the sustained targeting of leadership elements. But the success was creating exactly the kind of attention that would prove dangerous. NVA forces were adapting to the threat. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations indicated growing awareness that they were facing an unconventional American capability. Security around commanders was tightening. Movement patterns were becoming more unpredictable. And there were troubling references in NVA communications to ghost hunters or silent death, terms that suggested the enemy was developing their own narrative about what was targeting their leadership. More problematically, conventional American units operating in the same areas were asking questions. When battalion commanders saw intelligence reports indicating that NVA command elements in their area of operations had been eliminated, they wanted to know what unit had conducted the operation so they could coordinate future actions. The cover story, that eliminations were the result of long-range reconnaissance patrols or opportunistic engagements was becoming less credible as the frequency and precision of the operations increased. MACV Command faced a dilemma. SRU Delta was achieving strategic effects that conventional operations couldn't match, but maintaining the program required a level of secrecy that was becoming harder to sustain, and the methods being employed existed in legal and ethical gray areas that would be impossible to justify if subjected to scrutiny. The solution, as it turned out, wouldn't be to resolve those contradictions, but to bury them so deeply that they would take 50 years to emerge. The meeting that ended SRU Delta took place on January 15, 1968, in a secure conference room at MACV headquarters in Saigon. The timing was significant. This was just 2 weeks before the Tet Offensive would fundamentally change American perception of the war's progress. But the concerns that drove the meeting had nothing to do with strategic military developments and everything to do with political exposure and institutional liability. Present were senior MACV intelligence officers, a representative from the Judge Advocate General's office, a State Department liaison, and a classified programs oversight officer whose exact role was never clearly documented. The immediate trigger was the incident report from November 1967 that had finally worked its way through classification review. A SRU Delta team had eliminated an NVA political officer in circumstances that raised serious questions. The target had been located in a village inside Cambodian territory, operating among civilian population. The team had tracked the target for 6 days, waiting for an opportunity to conduct the elimination away from civilians. When that opportunity hadn't materialized, they'd made the decision to proceed anyway, using a close-range method during early morning hours that minimized but didn't eliminate civilian exposure. The operation was tactically successful. Target eliminated, team extracted without compromise. But the after-action report described civilian witnesses who'd observed armed individuals moving through the village, and Cambodian government protests about American military activity in their territory that required diplomatic responses involving denials that were technically false. The JAG representative framed the legal problem clearly. These operations are being conducted without written rules of engagement, in territories where American military presence is not authorized, using methods that don't conform to law of war principles regarding distinction between combatants and civilians, and with a level of autonomy that makes command responsibility nearly impossible to establish. The intelligence officers defended the program based on results. SRU Delta had eliminated dozens of high-value targets, disrupted NVA command structure, and achieved strategic effects with minimal resources and 0 American casualties. Terminating the program would eliminate a capability that conventional forces couldn't replicate. But the State Department liaison raised the question that would prove decisive. What happens when this becomes public? Not if, when. Personnel rotate home, people talk, journalists investigate. When the American public learns that we've been conducting targeted killings in neutral countries using methods that amount to assassination, the political damage will be catastrophic. Every operation we've justified as legitimate military action will be re-examined. Our moral authority in prosecuting this war will be undermined. The debate continued for 3 hours, but the conclusion was predetermined by institutional risk calculus. SRU Delta was effective, but effectiveness wasn't sufficient justification for political exposure. The program would be terminated immediately. Personnel would be reassigned to conventional duties or separated from service. All operational records would be reclassified at levels that would prevent disclosure for decades. Most critically, the intelligence product from SRU Delta operations would be reattributed. Enemy casualties they'd caused would be credited to conventional units or left unexplained in the record. Their contributions would be erased not through destroying documents, but through systematically removing attribution and context. A MACV intelligence colonel made a final argument. These men volunteered for extremely hazardous duty. They've performed exceptionally under conditions that would break most soldiers. They deserve recognition for their service. The response from the senior officer present was bureaucratically final. What they deserve and what we can afford to acknowledge are separate questions. Their service will remain classified. That protects them as much as it protects the institution. Within 2 weeks, every member of SRU Delta had been pulled from operations. Within a month, they'd been dispersed to different units throughout Vietnam or rotated back to the United States. Within 3 months, the classified designation, Special Reconnaissance Unit Delta, had been retired and removed from active program listings. The men who'd achieved what conventional forces couldn't, who'd eliminated enemy commanders with precision that seemed supernatural, who'd served with absolute loyalty under conditions of extreme danger. These men were about to learn that institutional gratitude extended only as far as political convenience allowed. Sif Kill's enemy returned to Pine Ridge Reservation in April 1968 with an honorable discharge, a combat infantryman badge, and orders never to discuss his actual service in Vietnam. His military records listed him as having served with Macy v. SOG duties classified. There was no mention of SRU Delta, no documentation of the operations he'd conducted, no record of the 23 confirmed eliminations his team had achieved over 14 months in the Central Highlands. He tried to process the experience. He'd gone to Vietnam believing that his traditional skills would finally be valued by the same government that had spent generations trying to erase them. He'd tracked and eliminated enemy commanders using knowledge his grandfather had passed down, proving that indigenous expertise had military value that modern training couldn't replicate. And now he was being told that none of it could be acknowledged, that his contributions were classified not for operational security, but for political convenience. The psychological cost was immediate and severe. He'd killed 23 men, not in firefights where survival instinct overrode moral calculation, but after days of tracking, observation, deliberate stalking that made each target a specific individual rather than an abstract enemy. He'd done this believing it served a legitimate military purpose, that eliminating commanders would save American lives and shorten the war. Now he was being told he couldn't discuss it, couldn't process it, couldn't even acknowledge it had happened. In 1971, he attempted to speak with a VA counselor about his experiences. The counselor asked standard questions about combat trauma, assuming he'd been in conventional infantry operations. When Kill's enemy tried to explain the actual nature of his service, the counselor noted in his file that he was making unverifiable claims about special operations and recommended evaluation for possible delusional disorder. Kill's enemy never sought VA mental health services again. He lived on the reservation, worked occasional jobs, and struggled with depression and alcohol abuse that his family and community recognized as war-related but couldn't help him address because he wouldn't talk about what had actually happened in Vietnam. He wasn't alone. William II Ravens returned from Vietnam in 1969 and was warned explicitly that discussing his SRU Delta service could result in prosecution under espionage laws. He carried that silence for 30 years through 2 marriages that failed partly because he couldn't explain the nightmares, through decades of employment struggles and social isolation. When he finally tried to tell his story in 1998 to a researcher studying Native American military service, he was visited by government representatives who reminded him that his non-disclosure obligations had no expiration date. 2 Ravens died in 2004 without ever publicly acknowledging his service. His obituary listed him as a Vietnam veteran, with no other details. The institutional erasure was systematic. The 14 men who'd served in SRU Delta were scattered across the country, forbidden from connecting with each other, prohibited from discussing their service even with other veterans. The skills that had made them valuable, traditional tracking and hunting knowledge, were once again dismissed as irrelevant primitive practices, their military applications classified into invisibility. By 1975, the Vietnam War had ended, and the official history of American operations was being written. SRU Delta appeared nowhere in that history. The NVA commanders they'd eliminated were listed as killed in action, with no attribution to specific American units. The strategic disruption they'd caused was credited to conventional operations or simply left unexplained. The few officers who'd commanded or coordinated with SRU Delta moved on to other assignments. Most never mentioned the program again, understanding that association with an operation that existed in legal gray areas could damage careers. Those who did reference it did so obliquely, in classified contexts where documentation was minimal. By 1980, even within the intelligence community, institutional memory of SRU Delta was fading. The program had existed for less than 2 years, involved fewer than 20 personnel, and had been deliberately structured to leave minimal documentary trail. It was becoming what it had always been designed to be: a ghost operation staffed by ghost warriors whose contributions would remain invisible indefinitely. 2015, a historian named Dr. James Blackfeather was researching Native American participation in the Vietnam War when he encountered an anomaly in VA records. He was reviewing treatment files for Lakota veterans and found multiple cases of men who'd served in Vietnam and been treated for severe PTSD, but whose service records showed no combat assignments. They were listed as intelligence analysts or support personnel who shouldn't have experienced direct combat trauma. Cross-referencing those records with declassified MACV documents, Dr. Blackfeather found references to a specialized reconnaissance capability that had operated in the Central Highlands in 1967–68. The references were fragmentary: budget line items that didn't correspond to known units, after-action reports with sections redacted under classifications that seemed excessive for conventional operations, intelligence assessments that credited eliminations of enemy personnel to sources that were never identified. He spent 4 years following that thread through archives, Freedom of Information Act requests, and interviews with surviving veterans who were willing to speak carefully about what they remembered. He found VA psychiatric evaluations describing Lakota Vietnam veterans with tracking and elimination trauma, clinical language that suggested very specific operational roles. He discovered personnel records showing Lakota men who'd enlisted in 1966-67 with minimal training before deploying to Vietnam and being assigned to MACV SOG, a cover designation so broad it could mean almost anything. Most significantly, he found the men themselves. In 2017, he located William II Ravens's family, who shared letters their father had written but never sent, letters describing operations in the Central Highlands, tracking NVA commanders through jungle terrain, the moral weight of killing men after watching them for days. The letters had been written as therapy, a way to process experiences he couldn't discuss with anyone else. In 2018, Dr. Blackfeather presented preliminary research at an academic conference on Native American military history. His presentation documented the existence of SRU Delta and provided evidence of its operational effectiveness. The response was immediate institutional pushback. A Department of Defense representative at the conference stated that portions of the operations described remained classified and that public discussion could compromise ongoing intelligence methods. Dr. Blackfeather challenged that assertion. These operations occurred 50 years ago. The men who conducted them are elderly or dead. The war ended decades ago. What possible intelligence methods are being protected by maintaining classification? The answer, though never stated explicitly, was clear. The methods weren't being protected. The liability was being contained. Acknowledging SRU Delta would require explaining why indigenous tracking and hunting knowledge was militarily valuable enough to weaponize, but not culturally valuable enough to preserve and honor. It would raise questions about targeted killings, operations in neutral countries, and a program that existed outside conventional rules of engagement and legal oversight. Dr. Blackfeather's research was published in a limited circulation academic journal in 2019, but was removed from the journal's website within 6 months after government legal review claimed it contained classified information. His subsequent attempts to publish expanded research were rejected by mainstream academic presses that cited legal concerns about classification issues. The Lakota stealth warriors represent a question that extends beyond Vietnam. What do we owe people whose marginalized knowledge becomes valuable enough to exploit, but remains too politically uncomfortable to acknowledge? The easy answer is that some things must stay classified for national security, that operational necessity justifies secrecy, and that individual recognition matters less than institutional protection. But that answer requires accepting that human beings can be used as weapons. Their cultural knowledge can be extracted and weaponized, and their contributions can be erased when acknowledgement becomes inconvenient. It requires believing that effectiveness justifies betrayal, that loyalty flows only in one direction, and that silence is an acceptable substitute for honor. The men who served in SRU Delta eliminated dozens of enemy commanders, disrupted NVA operations, and saved American lives using skills that had been dismissed as primitive until they proved militarily valuable. They were promised that their service mattered. Instead, they were classified into non-existence, their contributions erased, their trauma unacknowledged, their very existence denied. Most are gone now. Joseph Kill's enemy died in 1997, taking his stories to a grave that lists him simply as a Vietnam veteran with no other details. William Two Ravens died in 2004, forbidden even at the end to speak freely about his service. The few survivors are elderly, bound by non-disclosure agreements that have outlasted the war, outlasted most of their fellow warriors, and will likely outlast them. Their silence speaks if we're willing to hear it. It tells us that the most precise warriors aren't always the ones with the best technology, that indigenous knowledge systems contain military value that modern doctrine can't replicate, and that the truest measure of a nation's character isn't how it treats its heroes, but how it treats the warriors it chooses to forget. The Lakota stealth warriors were more precise than modern snipers. Their contributions were buried not because they were insignificant, but because they were too effective to acknowledge without uncomfortable admissions about whose knowledge matters and whose can be classified into invisibility. Command stopped talking about them because the truth was more threatening than the silence.